there was a scene where Simon Helberg had to do an impersonation of Stephen Hawking. And
I remember.
And Simon was like, hold on. I am not doing that in front of Professor Hawking. And then they checked, and he was like, oh, it's hilarious. Please do it. Please do it. And so then, in a run-through of a sitcom, there are like 30, 20 people watching. You're really close. So we're watching Simon, and he's doing his impersonation. Everybody turns to Stephen Hawking. Everybody says, and he had a little control, and he had a little smile. And it was just incredible.
I wanted to start off with, personally a big fan of the Big Bang Theory. But when I got the invite to do this panel, I was rewatching the show for the fourth or fifth time. So it was an easy yes for me. But I wanted to talk to you about your collaboration on the show, because you were a consultant and you're a writer. And obviously that collaboration can mean cooperation, conflict, all of that. But first, if you could just talk a little bit, because when I think of the Big Bang Theory, and I don't know how many of you here have watched episodes of that, yeah? I think of like the big whiteboards that Sheldon and Leonard are discussing, and I always wondered, what is all that mumble jumble on those whiteboards, and how much of it is accurate?
That's right. There were about 3. Can you hear me okay? There were about 3 whiteboards on the walls and 279 episodes, and every one had to be filled with science. So I'm not going to say every single one was A+1. So to have an idea was sometimes tough. So Tuesday night, I had to send over the equations and figures on the board. I wanted them to be figures too, so it would be a little bit interesting to look at. If I was lucky, the writers had some science in the episode, and it had to be science that it could have come up before the conversation they were having, because that would mean it was on the way. They could have plausibly been talking about it before. If it was a new topic that came up in discussion, then it couldn't. Why would it be on the whiteboard? So my first priority was if it was something they had been discussing, that was great. It would wind up. And other times it was just a little tribute to something going on in the world of science, like when the great John Wheeler passed away, kind of sensible that they would have been talking about his great works, and so that was on the boards.
Oh, I was just going to add that a friend of mine who's a physicist called me up after season 3. He was like, your show's so funny, it's so great. Those whiteboards are hilarious. Oh my God, who writes those? And it was all David. And I love how David, from that very beginning, I worked on 278 episodes, but he worked on 279. So he was there from the pilot, from the 2 pilots, like all the way back. And it's all about integrating character into it. You just said it beforehand in terms of like how do you take science to enhance character, and even doing that and just thinking about like all those little things that even back then in 2007, not thinking about streaming or how many times you'd see something, like how much can you put in an episode that can be Easter eggs and stuff that people can find. It is a total testament to like all of David's hard work.
What was the typical consultation process like? Because with the writer's room, you're coming up with the this is a multicam series. There's some continuity, but there's also like an episodic nature. So how are you, at what point in the process, like what comes first, the story or the science? And when does you talked a little bit about when the scientific concept gets introduced, but what's the general process like?
We had this really brilliant process where in the script we would write parentheses, science to come, close parentheses. And then as it progressed, we would put in science, which we learning from David, and our goal was to actually put in science that David would say was okay. And I think we got close. I don't think we ever did it totally, but I think once or twice we got close. But there were so many conversations between the staff and David, and everyone got his email from very on and just asked questions, really like, would you do this? Would you do that? Would you do that? And then you came to every single tape night, so that, which would take 4 or 5 hours. So there's just so many conversations. And then you also brought really awesome scientists, and that just kind of expanded the whole world.
Yeah, I'll just add, sometimes I think like, oh, this is a great something, they're gonna love it. Nothing. And then we'd just be talking and I'm not thinking about it at all. And that's when you go, I like that. So I stopped trying to predict what they would like and just talk to them.
And as the writers got more experienced, were they pitching you science concepts as well?
Well, didn't Steve Holland almost come up with an idea that you thought you could write a paper about?
I'm trying to remember which.
No, the answer is
Oh.
we thought there was this idea, and we put it in the Science to Come part, and Dave was like, that's interesting, maybe we should actually do that, and we all got so excited, but it was just fiction.
But the characters of the show, the main character Sheldon, is a know-it-all, and it's not just science. He has an opinion, and seemingly a factual opinion about everything, including the Bollywood actress Aishwarya Rai in one episode. So how did those other factual elements come up?
I mean, that really just from having 12 people in the writer's room and pitching tons of ideas and having the chance. I mean, we wrote everything together around the room. So if it took us 5 days to write a script, that's 10 people working for 40 hours all to get through that script. So that made it there was like a real compounding to all that.
And is there an example of a time when there was like pushback between the two of you, like you wanted to focus more on a story aspect and you wanted to focus more on the science aspect for a character maybe?
Well, I'm not the science police, right? It's their story, and you could imagine, the example I use, imagine if someone talked to the people writing Back to the Future and said, well, we can't do time travel. Do everything from there. Wouldn't work. So my job was just to let them know. And one example was they had Beverly, who was Leonard's mother, working with Sheldon on quantum brain dynamic theory, which it made sense because she was a neuroscientist and he was a quantum kind of particle physicist. It made sense. The problem is a lot of scientists don't take that theory very seriously, but they'd already written so much and I felt so bad. So I mentioned it and moved on. And then I got the next version of the script and they were working on disproving quantum brain dynamic theory.
So it works out. Aaron, you're the franchise science keeper for Star Trek since 2019, and there's been so many series that have come about. There is Prodigy, Discovery, Lower Deck, I just found out, and there's also a combination of animation and live action. So could you talk about your journey from being an astrophysicist to coming on consulting, and also since this is a show on this panel that is science fiction, what are the tightropes that you're walking between those realms?
Yeah, I think one of the ways you phrased it is actually a good thing to remember, that I'm not just trying to be the keeper of science and trying to make sure that what's coming out of their mouth sounds right, but also there's nearly 60 years of Star Trek science lore of warp drives and transporters and replicators and all of that I also have to manage and make sure that the way we talk about them in Prodigy is the same way we talk about them in Strange New Worlds. And so it's definitely a big creative jump for that. But yeah, I mean, most people are just like, how did that job happen? So Star Trek has had science consultants from day one. Gene Roddenberry would call up his buddies at Hughes or Raytheon and ask them questions. And famously, one of them was the one that recommended he call it the warp drive and not the time warp drive, which predating Rocky Horror was probably a good move. And but for me, I went through academia. I did my PhD in gravitational waves and general relativity. I got into Star Trek when I was in college, so a little bit later than a lot of sort of the diehard Trekkies you might think of. But you can't not watch Star Trek when you're a physicist, as I think was pretty well demonstrated in the Big Bang Theory. And but for me, I realized academia wasn't for me. I loved teaching, and so I went into engineering, which is what eventually got me out to Los Angeles. But during that time, I would go to science fiction conventions and teach the physics of Star Trek, or one of my favorite ones is Mass Effect, the video game series. So I would do all the science that's in Mass Effect, and that's kind of what got me on the radar of a lot of writers and TV creators. And then Star Trek actually brought me on as a fan-facing person first. So they were having me come to their conventions and give my Physics of Star Trek talks. And then when season 3 of Star Trek Discovery came up, which for those of you who have seen it, I was not responsible for the spore drive. Don't ask me about the spore drive. That's a different thing. I can talk about it, but I didn't help create it because I was in season 1. But for season 3, they were kind of hitting the reset button. They got a new showrunner, Michelle Paradise, and she wanted to bring on a few scientists to help with the story arc of that season. So I was hired just to help with the story arc. And then that relationship went really well. I was living in Los Angeles. They had greenlit all these other shows. And so we had a conversation about bringing me on as just the resident scientist, again, to maintain all of that continuity and have the same person. So I'm available to all the shows as much or as little as they want to use me. It's been a fun journey on all of them. They're all very different in their own unique way, but I think we've kept that backbone of science that Star Trek's really known for. So I'm really proud of that.
Is there an example? I read that your training is in gravitational waves and in general relativity. I just know those terms. I don't know what they mean. But when, I guess, and this is a question maybe for others on the panel as well, is there, do you experience dissonance when something that you're trained in scientifically has to be adapted towards a story element? And how do you deal with that?
Yes.
And anyone on the panel can answer this.
I'll start because I have a really direct story for this, and then I can pass it down. But so gravitational waves are ripples in space-time. If you may have seen the bowling ball and the trampoline idea of how gravity works. You flick marbles around it, they orbit like planets orbit the sun. And then Einstein had this idea. He's the one that put the bowling ball on the trampoline to see what would happen, but then also thought, well, what if the bowling ball explodes? And basically it was this idea that the trampoline would ripple, that space-time would send out ripples that we call gravitational waves. But they're really like compression waves. They're kind of like sound waves more than actual ripples because we're talking about a 4-dimensional fabric. And so in season 4 of Star Trek Discovery, they wanted to have a plot where they have to ride the gravitational waves out of this anomaly. And gravitational waves don't work that way, and that's okay. But it was a cool idea. And and I was like, okay, well, if you think about it like sound waves, we can kind of get away with it. It's a pretty new field of astronomy. It's big. It'd be fun to have the words gravitational waves in Star Trek. I'm not going to say no to that. But they had the whole scene where they're in the ready room and they're sort of explaining what they're going to do, and they showed waves like an ocean wave that they were going to surf out. And I was like, no, they don't work that way. And it was all collaborative, but I also work a lot in the post-production and with the motion graphics team, so I kind of gave the note, compression waves, like sound waves that are passing through. And to their credit, they redid the whole scene with the sound compression waves in there, and then we all watched it, and it threw everyone out because it just didn't work for what they were talking about, and it would throw the audience. You'd never want to pull them out of the moment because they're like, I thought they were going to ride them out, but how do you ride those? And so we left it in as ripples, and let me tell you, when that aired, and the amount of colleagues who messaged me were like, Aaron, you had one job. But, they tried. And yeah, we had, the viewer is the most important thing. And the last thing we want to do is pull them out. And that tiny fraction of gravitational wave astrophysicists who were mad about it kind of, it's fine. I'm fine. All right. Anyone else has stories?
Pass it to you two. One of you. What was the question?
The question is if something that you've been trained in as a scientist or as a doctor, when you're converting that into a story element, is there some sort of compromise you've got to make the idea accessible or just to make it more palatable?
I'm a little unusual in that I started as a consultant. I haven't actually done any medical consulting since 2014 now, but when I started, I was very focused on the accuracy, and I was meticulous about making the story work in service of the medicine. I've since crossed over, and I now mainly do screenwriting and directing, and when my work occasionally does touch medicine, I am cavalier in being accurate because my priorities have all shifted, and now all I care about is the story. So I've gone from one hand being very fastidious about accuracy to probably being a little reckless.
Was that shift easy? Or was it, because I can relate to that a little bit, because in my early years when I just finished my PhD, I was, I had my academic hat more tightly worn on my head, and then slowly I feel like, as what you're saying, I feel like you kind of lose your interest in your training. But how was that journey for you? Because I know you're still practicing as a radiation oncologist, but if you were to write a feature or a show involving that, would you be very more particular with regard to that domain, because that is your current practice as well?
Yeah, one thing that's helped is, so when I co-created The Resident, I was still a practicing resident, and I actually asked not to be involved with any of the medicine generation, so I wasn't a medical consultant on the show, so having a divide helped. Later on, I sort of drifted away from writing about medicine at all because I didn't want to be in that position of being inaccurate about the thing that I still do love and care for. Lately, I've decided to return to writing about medicine, and that's where I'm sort of experiencing the dissonance that you were referring to before. And that's the craziest and the hardest thing. But it definitely is difficult to switch. I find it easier when I can keep two sides of my brain, one that is purely medical and then one that is purely creative. When the two have to cross, and at least inside my brain rather than between two people, I do find it difficult.
Jake, you have a very distinguished background as working in with Jimmy Kimmel and being a writer on late night for so many years, and that's a certain kind of pitching and writing that you're doing before you crossed over, and please correct me if I got your biography wrong, to becoming an emergency physician. Like you went to become a doctor, and now you also practice as an emergency physician. Talking about different parts of your brain, do you think that there is something in your training as a late night comedy writer that helped you, I don't know, you're kind of constantly coming up with ideas, so does that make you a certain kind of responsive in an emergency room setting?
Fully. That's a good question. I don't know. I've never actually thought of it that way. I think the chaos. Well, I shouldn't describe late night as chaos, but it's kind of chaos. So I think I think I had a higher threshold for sort of spinning plates, for lack of a better term. So I think in that regard, working in an emergency room wasn't too much of a shift. It's just that the stakes were higher, but just having a lot of different things going on, I was kind of used to already. I think, I don't know. I think the thing I always think was like it's just I have a probably, I hope anyway, but I think a lot of things are really funny to go on at work. So I think a lot of situations are way funnier than probably the patients do. I think I don't know. I'd agree. I think that I kind of keep those parts of my brain pretty separate. But I think I have a high tolerance for chaos, I suppose.
Well, the challenges in medical drama is that you're also just dispensing so many facts, and especially that's true of The Pit, but even in The Resident. But they're also very different shows, because The Resident has, from what I've seen of it, I haven't seen too much of it, there's also a lot of behind the scenes, there's melodrama, and there's romance, and there's confrontation, and there's a soapiness about it. Whereas The Pit feels a little bit I don't know if anyone has seen these shows, but The Pit, I just binge watched all 15 episodes, and I'd recommend watching it on a weekly basis than binge watching. But there's different emphases on character and story in those. So how do you deal with just writing, dispensing, the amount of medical detail to give? And how are you working with the writers in coordinating that in the space of a medical drama, which I feel like is a different beast than sci-fi and in Big Bang Theory?
Yeah, I think exposition is the bane of all medical shows, and I think everybody has a different view and approach to it, and I differed even from the people who really ran The Resident, because I was only involved for the first 4 or 5 episodes and left after that in order to stay in residency. But my approach with exposition has always been actually not to explain too much of the medicine, because I think it sounds very artificial and not real when two characters stop to explain something to each other that they both know. For example, he has a pulmonary embolism, which is a clot in the lung. They would never say that to each other, but they do all the time on medical shows, and that kind of thing always takes me out, at least as a doctor watching, but I think even if you're not a doctor, I think audiences actually sometimes watch medical shows in order to be wrapped up in an atmosphere of verisimilitude where they're just surrounded by details, whether they know them or not. It just feels real, and there's something about being inside that hurricane that is comforting. So I've always been on the side of not explaining anything, but probably taking that too far at times. But I will say there's a whole spectrum, even within the creators and the writers of a single show.
Can I add something to that? I think what's interesting is, so a lot of the Star Trek fans are also really big fans of the Pit, just like on social media. And the way people described it was, again, kind of being in that swirl. They called it like, it's just competence porn. Like, we're just watching people be really good at their job, which is something that we like watching Star Trek for. And we were like watching some of these medical dramas, which to your point was like, you're just immersed in it and you just trust them. And I think that's something with the sci-fi is sometimes you as the audience member, if there is a backbone of real science built into it, be it a medical drama or a science fiction series, the audience feels it, and you don't necessarily need to explain every single thing. If it's got that backbone, it carries itself forward.
I thought it was really great that we had Penny on the show, because that was a good reason for them to be explaining things. So having a character who doesn't know what the other people know helped, right?
Yeah, and Chuck Lorre, the co-creator of the show, has been so successful, and his previous shows have been so international, that he intuitively knew that he wanted it to be explained. So even on the nerd stuff, you would say like, but if we make that Death Star from Star Wars out of Legos, then what? And you're like, well, no one would say that. But they're like, people in China are going to learn English from the show, which they did, so you need to do it. So he had that already in his mind.
And of course, that makes Sheldon very happy because he has more chances to explain everything to his characters. But then that also brings up the idea of audiences, and I always love to ask writers and consultants how much are they paying attention and what assumptions are you making about audiences, and you don't know exactly who the future audiences of your shows could be as well. So how are you, how much, like, in terms of jargonness of things, and I just created a new word, jargonness, and also the idea that like certain scientific concepts could be revised in the future. How much are you thinking about those things with respect to some of the work that y'all have been doing?
So I used to get these little brackets that said science to come, and the issue is exactly what you said, which sometimes they wanted something that was complete gibberish that nobody would understand unless they were getting a PhD in that topic right now. And other times it was supposed to sound sciencey, but there was a pretty good chance people would understand some of it. And I tried to figure out from the context which you wanted, but I didn't always know, or rarely knew. So I would actually give 4 or 5 choices. And then I guess, I don't actually know what you did with them. I presume you guys, why don't you tell?
So Bill Prady would get those on his email, and he would read them aloud, and we would all go, 3rd one, 4th one, or whatever. And it was because it was more of a gut feel of what that was for there. But it was really helpful to have those examples, because otherwise you just need to hear it without, it would be too hard to explain what you're going for.
One of the tricky things with the writing and dialogue aspect is sometimes like Lower Decks was great, adult animated Star Trek comedy. They would just put in, and then the quantum of the quantumness did the quantum thing. And that was my brackets, insert science here. And but what was useful with that is that what they were cluing me into was how long they wanted the line to be and what the syllables were that they wanted to hit. So then when I write the science, I have to get it into that space, which was the same even like on Discovery, I think had probably the most scientific jargon that I would make edits on as we were going through, but trying to make sure the cadence and the word choices and the flow of the dialogue stayed the same was a really creative exercise. But to your point about the knowing your audience, Star Trek fans will pause and check your math. and when it's future science too, you have a lot of leeway, but you don't want to be completely making it up. So, we would have where they were, for example, trying to figure out that this thing was a wormhole, and that's the end point that they get to, but they need all the puzzle pieces, and they need to be sitting and staring at equations and trying to reason through it. But this is like future math, and wormholes are mathematically theoretical, but we've never detected them, but in Star Trek we have. And then we also need the little clues that they're gonna know that indicates a wormhole that we've only barely started to think about. And so the exercise of going into really theoretical physics and then trying to pull equations, and it got enough that when people paused it and screen grabbed it and put it online for other people to study, they were like, oh, it's general relativity. Okay, it is wormholes. That's good. Oh, I see tachyons in there. Okay, that's cool. That's sciencey enough. So yeah, they do check. So I need to be on my game, or they're coming for me.
I think audiences in general are very intelligent. Maybe the only difference is that they are there to be entertained. They're not there to learn. Nobody is watching The Resident or The Pit to learn. They are maybe in a sense, but they're primarily there to be entertained, and that's your primary job. But sometimes I see the other end of the spectrum, like Christopher Nolan, who I think does very interesting things with science, where his stories sometimes depend on a fairly sophisticated understanding of it. Interstellar, for example, requires understanding relativity in some ways. That is a movie that obviously came out of Kip Thorne in part, so came from physics, but he doesn't shy away from it because Interstellar is a movie for mass audiences. It's not like it's just for science nerds. And there's similar arguments to be made about Oppenheimer, which also doesn't shy away from it. So it's not that jargon or being intense about science is a bad thing. And in Interstellar, it's one of the pleasures of the story and the movie is understanding the science, makes you understand the story. Those two things are very linked, which they're not always.
Yeah, the way we talk about science fiction, at least in my mind, is that it's a spectrum from science to fiction. And fans it's like meeting another heavy metal fan, right? You're always like, but what kind? and it's the same with science fiction. There's really, really hard sci-fi, and then there's, laser swords in space, which are also great, and we love them, but it's, it's not rooted in that scientific thing. And so when you approach a show, knowing where they want to land is the first thing. Who do they want their audience to be? And then you can adjust the science from there.
David was a consultant on Oppenheimer, so he had the experience of getting notes from Chuck Lorre and Chris Nolan, which are very, very different.
How were they different?
So the interesting challenge about that was that when I did mostly whiteboards, the script was already pretty immaculate, already been read by Kip Thorne. But there is something to watch out for that I only learned by doing historical pieces that I did not learn on Big Bang Theory, which is something can be correct, but not at that time. So you could use the word black hole in the 1940s, but it wasn't coined until the 1960s. And I made that mistake once on a show, and then you just don't make it again, but the first time you make it, so there's something called Google Ngram, which was really my friend, which tells you versus year when a word started to appear. So.
Interesting.
You see that a lot in Star Trek, actually. Star Trek, one of my friends wrote a book called Live Long and Evolve. Professor Mohammed Noor is an evolutionary biologist at Duke, and he went through the words through evolutionary biology that we were learning from 1966 all the way up until now and how they presented themselves in Star Trek. So, we had the mapping of the genome in the late 90s, and Enterprise is all genetics, and the human genome and all of that. And so you can see how the scientific language of genetics started to evolve, and then in Star Trek, how they used those different words as well. It's really fascinating.
One of the things that interests me is that when we have shows about science that integrate story, we're not simply talking about scientific facts, but we're also talking about the social side and the communal side of practicing science and being scientists. One of the lines of dialogue in The Pit that I could relate to is in one of the early episodes, I don't know if it was one of the episodes that you worked on, where one of the doctors told the intern that they should listen to the nurses because nurses know what they're doing. And that's something that we also, when I was in the communication program, that's something that, like, research shows that nurses are constantly undervalued in that setting. So I was curious about not just the science, the facts of science that you're focusing on, but what are y'all, what kind of consulting work or what kind of writing work are you doing to portray science as a community?
I've talked a lot.
Well, I didn't write that. I wasn't a writer on the show, just to be clear. I wasn't in the writer's room. I was on set, making sure everything, helping things look real. I guess what I would say is that line works because it's true, right? Like, so, and I think, like everyone else is saying, that I think these shows and movies and things, like, in my opinion, tend to succeed because they don't undervalue the audience's intelligence, and they, like, people know they just have a sense of what's inauthentic, and so, like, you don't have to go to medical school or nursing school to watch The Pit or The Resident and say, like, oh, that seems right, like, and it's just because people have that sense. And so I think the more you capture, or the more people are able to get things accurate, and also, like, the social dynamics of, like, how does the, attending physician oversee the residents, overseeing, like, the fourth year and the third year and the second year, and making sure, and, like, kind of corralling all of them and keeping your eye on the medical student, all those things. Like, I think I don't know. My sense is that just humans have a good sense of what seems real and when it's kind of phoned in. I don't know. I think a lot of my favorite, for me anyway, like, a lot of my favorite shows, like, even in, like, the tertiary part where they, like, involve science, like, like Breaking Bad, right? It's like, it's not about chemistry, but, like, the chemistry's, I think, good. So I'm like, I think people just have a sense that it's right. And so, I don't know. But science and I guess medicine is what I can speak to, has its own, like, social dynamics that are, like, very real and relevant. And I don't know. The more that you can make those kind of be present, I think it's just going to work better.
I was going to add, I had a suspicion that when it was all accurate, it helped the actors. It would be nice to know if actors were here, but I think if they knew that the dialogue they were saying had been vetted, it was easier for them to really get into it. And the same was true for sets and props. I think just creating this world for the actors that they can really sell it had some value.
Yeah, we had a arc where one of the actors went on the space shuttle, and so I don't know how we found Mike Massimino, but he ended up being on the show as one of the astronauts, and it was super helpful for Simon, because he fixed the Hubble telescope. He had the longest spacewalk record at the time, and so when he said something, everyone's like, "Do that." Definitely, whatever, Mike said that you don't do that, so I don't think we should do that. So I think it does make it easier, in that way. And then just a Breaking Bad reference, you mentioned, like, they got the science right. You brought the the consultant to Breaking Bad to the show, and I remember she told the story that the way she became the science consultant, that she wrote the writers a letter after the first season and said, "It was pretty good. You guys did a pretty good job. Here's what you got wrong." Oh, wow. And then, if my memory serves, and then they're like, "Okay, well, why don't you be our consultant?" I think she's like at University of Arizona.
It's Dr. Donna Nelson. She's fantastic at University of Oklahoma.
Oklahoma, great.
I guess that was one of my questions is, what is the feedback that y'all have received from the public or from, like, you said that Star Trek fans are very responsive, but and they will correct mistakes, but have you gotten criticisms from the larger scientific community regarding a concept that was portrayed or a storyline that you brought in, and how did you respond to that?
When I first started The Resident, and even before I was a consultant primarily, and then I moved into screenwriting, and then I co-created The Resident with 2 other writers. And when The Resident pilot aired, I got a lot of feedback to my medical address about the medicine on the show. And some of it was very valid, and I had no reply. And then some of it was like kind of crazy. Someone said a central line placement would never happen in less than 2 minutes, which is how long it takes on the show. But obviously, we're not going to show like the full continuous central. Nobody's going to be sitting there watching it. So there was like irrational. Yeah, can you imagine just slowly draping, getting it right, really getting it. You have to start over. So nobody's going to watch that. But so there's feedback like that is irrelevant, more or less. But I think it's tough. I think there is a responsibility to get it right, because people are watching, and maybe it's influencing what they do. I think ER, for example, demonstrated that the stories they would put on that show when it was being watched by 30 or 40 million people would actually influence public thinking. So, for example, they did an episode on the connection between HPV and cervical cancer, and they were a huge part of the uptick in Gardasil and the public understanding of the connection between those two things. That was in the day when a single show would be watched by 30 to 40 million people. That's obviously less true now. So my rule has always been, from my consulting days, which again are more than a decade out, is the inaccuracy irresponsible? Because there is irresponsible inaccuracy, and then there's inaccuracy like the amount of time it takes to do a central line placement that is essentially meaningless.
And one thing just that this isn't really about the accuracy of science, but when Stephen Hawking was on the show, we went to Caltech and filmed him in his office, and he wanted to come see the show performed. Like, he wanted to go to a run-through. He asked if that was okay. Everyone's like, yeah, of course. And so he and Kip Thorne came to the Thursday run-through, and in that, there was a scene where Simon Helberg had to do an impersonation of Stephen Hawking. And,
I remember.
And Simon was like, hold on. I am not doing that in front of Professor Hawking. And then they checked, and he was like, oh, it's hilarious. Please do it. Please do it. And so then, in a run-through of a sitcom, there are like 30, 20 people watching. You're really close. So we're watching Simon, and he's doing his impersonation. Everybody turns to Stephen Hawking. Everybody says, and he had a little control, and he had a little smile. And it was just incredible. And everyone said that he totally loved it. But that's speaking to the kind of like interacting with your audience. You have these weird moments where it's really direct.
Stuff of legend, right? I guess another thing I was curious about is actually working on set. Of course, you can have the script with the placeholders, but if you're actually if you're a consultant on set, if you're, Jake, as you were saying, you were like, a lot of your work is figuring out like maybe what instruments that they're going to be using for a certain surgical procedure. What is the chaos of that like? And are you brought in, like, does the first AD bring you in a certain moment? Like, how does it actually work? Are you actually there?
The way the pit works is, and I gotta really, like, honestly, you should be talking to like the makeup people and the props people. Like, they're way more interesting and had a much bigger role. So I wasn't involved. There's a doctor who writes on the show, so like that's where the medical stories and the medical like terminology comes from. But then for the episodes I was assigned, there were 3 of us. You would get the episode, then you have like 9 days of prep, and so like, and then 9 days of shooting. But like those 9 days of prep are like where you figure all that out. So like you go and, there's meetings with like the props people, and they're like, they want clarification about like when you say, an 18 gauge angiocath, is this what you mean? And making sure they're buying the right thing, on a website before they purchase it for thousands of dollars. Like, so there's that, and then also meeting with like the makeup people when they're like, we made this wound. Is this a good wound? So there's like kind of going to those things, and there's production meetings and stuff. And I gotta really give credit. I mean, seriously, the props people are incredible. The makeup people are incredible. The wardrobe people are incredible, and they're just so. It was the thing that I really love about the show is just like, it's such a joy, and I don't know, maybe this is the appeal of some of these shows too. Like, it's just a joy to be around like professionals, like people who just like get stuff done and just know what they're doing, and they're really good at something. And so those 9 days of prep really, we got stuff sorted out. So when we went to shoot, like stuff was ready, and we weren't staying late. You know, most days we were like 7 to 5, 7 to 6 or whatever. So there wasn't any going over on time and all that insanity that, you know, ends up happening at a lot of places. And I credit that to like just the professionalism of the different departments. But my job, you know, I'm like a hired gun for I'm just there to answer questions and say like, this is what that means, or this is like, that's what this monitor would look like. Telling the video people like, no, like this should change that or whatever. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question at all, but yeah.
For sure. And
We did it ahead of time.
Erin, since you also are a voice actor on the show, how do you like? That's like a whole new hat, and but for you, like in terms of the animation production timeline versus live action, where do you come into those different processes?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned this because we were talking about set design, and when you meet people who are science advisors, sometimes they're just set decorators, but that's a big job, or they just work in the writer's room, and I am more writer's room. I've actually never been on a Star Trek set. I will crawl over bodies to be able to go onto a Star Trek set, but it's the future. Everything's on a hologram. so all of the stuff I do for set design is done remotely, and I work with motion graphics team for that. And so, but with animation, yeah, so I did voice acting, and it was because they turned me into a character on Star Trek Prodigy. In fact, only myself and Professor Stephen Hawking have played themselves on Star Trek, and no pressure. But that was born out of, so I'm not playing like myself currently. It's me as a character, Dr. Aaron McDonald, a professor at Starfleet Academy, which really was my dream job in college, so I nailed that one. But the reason it came about was because we created this character named Rock Talk, and my primary job on Star Trek Prodigy wasn't so much to get the science right, but that was a kids show, and it was the first Star Trek kids show, and they wanted it to be inspiring for kids to get into science. We talked about that effect and how like representation and the Scully effect and the things people have studied to show how representation has that. And so for me, they modeled a lot of Rock Talk on like my little Aaron's journey becoming a scientist and like figuring out what paths you want to go down and the trial and error of biology and field work and medicine and ruling that out super fast. And so at the end of season 1, the showrunners, you know, the kids, spoiler alert, they get to Starfleet Academy, and the showrunners were like, well, Rock Talk has to meet Dr. Aaron. So I was like, and they brought me in, and it was just an unnamed little cameo of just a nice moment where I could kind of set Rock Talk on her path of the science she wanted to study. But then we went into season 2, and season 2 was all about time travel. And it's a huge time travel storyline. I was writing this season while Loki was airing, and I was like, I'm in the TVA, because I was like making sure all the timelines closed and that it was all self-consistent. But we realized because it's a kids show, some kids have never seen a time travel storyline. Like they might not have even seen Back to the Future yet. So how do you explain like cause and effect and things that happen in the past changes the future? So we decided to have, because they already had the Dr. Aaron assets, so they were like, well, let's have a Mr. DNA style like time travel 101 with Dr. Aaron. so we did that, and it was a delight because the process of animation takes a really long time, years and years. From the writing the episodes is the first thing you do, and then if you're not involved in any of the later animation process, it's way later. And so the voice acting kind of comes in somewhere in the middle, where they have some of the assets, but obviously they're going to model it off over your acting. And but this was, deep COVID, so I'm like the only person in Nickelodeon Studios on the phone to someone else recording my lines, but it was still a pretty cool experience. So yeah, thanks.
A question for all of you. What are some underrepresented fields or concepts that you'd like to see in stories in television?
Yeah.
Okay, my sister would be really mad at me if I didn't mention this. She's always pitching. This would be because a lot of writers here, right? They can take it. my sister always pitching, she's got a degree in genetic counseling, and there's infinite stories about what people are finding, what it means for their families, history, family future. So if somebody wants to pick that up, I'm sure my sister would help.
The best fact I learned about genetic counseling, by the way, this was from my friend Mohammed, who also consulted on season 3 of Star Trek Discovery, the evolutionary biologist. He said 1 in 17 DNA genetic tests has a surprise relative. So bear that in mind. 1 in 17, yeah.
I think, there's so many systemic issues with medicine that I wish would come up more often on medical shows, including the ones that I've worked on, because so much of the job in the hospital is battling the system, and it has nothing to do with the human body. It's the fact that insurance companies dominate so much of what we do. We spend more of our time writing notes than we do anything else. We're often cornered into very brief patient encounters because of the enormity of stuff that we have to do outside of those patient encounters, and it's very difficult to be present and empathetic in those encounters. Patients are equally as frustrated that you can't get a hold of your doctor anymore. You just call, and there's a phone maze, and it leads nowhere. And you have the portal, and you're sending DMs to your doctor. And the whole system is so completely messed up in a way that sometimes I don't think medical shows completely do justice to. The enormity of the dysfunction, which is so much the tone and tenor of our lives when we're in the hospital. So that's the thing that I wish would come up more often, because I think people would relate to it. And that's all related, by the way, to the systemic disenfranchisement of people in the system. It's brutally sexist and racist and all those things, which are things, again, that I think the shows can do a better job of touching on.
Yeah, and I would just tack on, and this doesn't, I don't know if anyone wants to make a TV show about this, but I believe, I completely agree with Raj, but it is by design. Like, the small number of people make a lot of money in American healthcare. It's something like 1/8 or something of the GDP of our economy is healthcare, and like a small number of people make a tremendous amount of money just hurting people, and that's real. Like I believe in my heart, and I'm not like a crazy radical, but like I'm like, these people should go to prison. Like the people who run healthcare are practicing medicine without a license, and they're just like hurting people. They hurt people, and we both see it all the time. And there's something there, man. I don't know. There's some story there, but I'm like hoping that some like brave attorney at some point will just put together like a class action and just bring the whole thing crashing down, because as we both can confirm, it's incredibly hard to work in that system. It really saps the joy from the job constantly.
One thing I'm hopeful for and excited about are stories that have market-driven solutions for climate tech. I think there's just so much sadness for kids, and we need to inspire them. And the government isn't going to lead, but ideas will. And when you come up with cheaper, better things that disrupt, those are great stories. And how those things happen and the conflicts that happen along the way, there's a version of Dallas, there's a version of Succession, there's a version of The Big Bang Theory, there's a version of every single one of those things. But to have it in the background, not driving it, it's always characters, it's always conflict, it's always the things you care about. But Chuck and Bill, who created Big Bang Theory, did this thing that was really interesting, which was early on, they were going to make them software engineers. And obviously that worked well with Silicon Valley, you can totally do that. But they decided if we make them physicists, they're going for a bigger thing. They're trying to understand the universe, they're trying to do those things. And I think with things like climate tech, you are trying to create something that can make the world better, and it can propel itself and doesn't rely on foundations and other things like that. And I think that can be really inspiring.
And I think one thing that really helps is if more scientists and doctors write, because in the beginning I was so intimidated by the practice of screenwriting as a medical consultant.
It's so much easier than being a doctor.
It's so much easier.
So much easier.
It's really,
oh my God, there are like 10 people who help you,
Yeah.
and then you're like, if we're gonna die, if we don't, you don't die.
No, I've now done it for a decade, and it's like nothing compared to medicine. Like an average day in a hospital, I've never had a day in the hospital that has anything as easy as any of the days I've had on 3 movies that I've directed. And screenwriting as well is difficult, but it's not as difficult as medicine or some forms of science. And I think like the more the stories come out of us, the more interesting possibilities there are, because we have so much to say. One thing that we have as scientists over the average person is that we don't live very narrow lives. The average screenwriter, and I'm sure this isn't true of you, is living in the hills without reception, drinking bottled water, air conditioned. They're not talking to real people.
That's pretty accurate.
And we're in the real world because we're taking care of everybody. We're taking care of plumbers, of CEOs, of everybody. And as a result, we're experiencing the real world in a way that makes us probably have more vital things to say, irregardless of our actual talent. As writers, we have experiences and viewpoints. And the same thing is true of physicists. You understand how the universe is actually constructed. That's a big up over a screenwriter.
And you've met the most weird, interesting people who you can just base characters on.
Yes.
Yeah, to that point, I mean, I will say I've been really grateful for Star Trek because it has a long history of mentoring science advisors into the screenwriting pipeline. And even though the model is very different now than it was in the 90s, because in the 90s, the Rick Berman era, they would just assign the science advisor an episode, right? And that would be their screenwriting credit, and then they would be able to kind of move in through. And so even though we don't have that opportunity now with 10 episode seasons, what they have been able to do is let me shadow writers' rooms, let me work directly with the showrunners, build a mentoring relationship, and just get, tighten my samples, help me get representation, just to the point that should those roles come up, like I'm ready to hit the ground running. And we all know it's a little tough these days. But, I'm still really grateful for Star Trek as a franchise and a lot of science fiction to see that potential and really try to get scientists into the writing pipeline as well.
I'll toss this out there for if you guys want to steal this idea. But I always think like a crazy show would be about, so there's the ER, right, that you all see and go to when you're sick or get hurt. There are psychiatric ERs. And like as a medical student, my first psych rotation, or like one of my first rotations as a third-year medical student, was at the psychiatric emergency room in Harbor, UCLA, down in Torrance, which is a county hospital. And I got there and they were like, "Oh, here's your key." And I was like, "Oh, there's a key, all right." I was like, "What do I do with the key?" They're like, "I just make sure you lock the door." And I was like, "Okay, sure." And then I went in there. I went into the psychiatric ER, and it's wild. Like, I mean, and like there are people having profound mental health crises, and there are doctors and nurses like working there to help these people and stabilize them. And it's like it's dangerous work often, and it's like it's not your Beverly Hills psychiatrist, like, talking to you about how much Xanax you're gonna need for this trip. Like, they are like really. One of the people who works there, like they're like incredible people. Like one guy, I think like debriefed Jeffrey Dahmer. Like he's like an incredible person, and he's just like, yeah, this is what I care about. And like you see, and I got to see people in like the true throes of like mental health crises where they're like. In another version, like those people get shot by the police, right? Like, and somehow some police officer has the presence of mind to just like get them in a set of handcuffs and bring them to us. And like, and watching them like stabilize those people over a few days, going from like truly like dangerous, psychotic, like hearing voices screaming that they need to cut off everyone's heads, to like get the demons out, to like kind of getting them to a place where they're like pretty okay, and like talking to you, and it's pretty cool. I don't know if you guys want to steal that, steal it. That's a whole other world. It's crazy, but it might be worth.
Can I pitch on that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. There's also a mental health court in Los Angeles, and it's on Hollywood Boulevard. And so they even have that relationship too. So it's like the legal drama and the medical drama, but through that lens.
Yeah.
Run with it.
The dude I was talking about, like he like had to go there on Wednesdays, and he like made me come with him, and I was just like, why? He's just like, I just care about this stuff, and we went to mental health court.
You're getting a lot of good ideas here. To kind of close off, we've already begun talking about it and it's been a great discussion. I'm sure many of you are inspired to maybe try consulting or also work with consultants for your shows. So we've begun talking about what any advice for like the writers amongst you all to what are some good practices to work with consultants and vice versa for consultants? What are some good practices to work with writers?
I think speaking from science fiction, the earlier you can bring us in, the better. The earlier when you're world building, when you're trying to think of some of the technology and the sciences, just to have a conversation. There are a lot of great science communicators on social media that you're able to find. If people are on Blue Sky, you can find groups and just look up like astronomy communicators and go through and find people that you jive with, like read their bios and reach out to them. And a lot of people are, really collaborative, and some relationships will work, some won't. But I think the relationships work the best when you are able to get in the process early. I do a lot of work on development projects of just people who are pitching, or they've got some meetings, or they're in the pilot phase, and we just start world building. And I think it just, again, maybe none of that will ever make it into the series Bible that they take forward, but it will give them more confidence in the worlds that they're pitching. And so, yeah, the earlier the better is the advice I can give.
Okay, just a little bit to the writers and a little bit to maybe if there's any future consultants out there. To the writers, don't be afraid of the consultants. We're not going to give you a C-. We're here to help you. There'll be no quiz, so don't be afraid. And the flip side of that is, I found Dave mentioned that I went to the episodes being taped, and I was actually I originally went thinking I'd be needed somehow, but you'd never change almost a word of the science. But it was because I would talk to the writers in person a little bit. It just opened the door to make it so much easier for them to ask a question or then email me later or call me later. And so, I think this post-pandemic, we're so used to Zoom and emailing everything and work from home, but just being present with another person in the same room made a huge difference.
That is good advice. And to both consultants and to writers, the best lesson from being in a writer's room I've ever learned is pitch the fix. Don't point out what's wrong. That is not helpful at all. You only speak if you have a solution. And if it's not that solution, you get in the boat and row, and you want to help that person whose idea it is, and it's not your thing, it's their thing, and you want to help and just always pitch the fix.
To the writer, I guess would be the similar advice of getting in early and understanding it and having a natural curiosity and interest in it, not just looking at you as someone who's going to fill it in, but rather, interested in the actual underlying science. And then for the consultants, it's the sort of what I said before, which is I think you should just write as much as possible, even if you're not being asked to. When I started as a medical consultant, I just sent unsolicited script pages. Sometimes they were medical, sometimes they weren't, and they often used them. And the exercise of being creative actually made their show better. It wasn't that I was making an imposition on them. I was actually giving them very useful stuff. So I wouldn't see there's such a strict line between being a consultant and a writer. I think the natural progression in some ways is to become the creative.
I just echo all that. Ask questions.
Yeah, it's not. I think being factual and being creative it's not a binary. They kind of feed into each other. Well, this has been an amazing conversation. I really learned a lot myself, and I hope the audience folks have also enjoyed it. Please give our panelists a round of applause. And here's to more accuracy, and in our times of crises, we need it even more. So more collaboration. Thank you.